Okay. Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Rico van der Murray, and I am a Food Security and Markets Advisor with USAID's Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance. Thank you so much for joining this presentation on the SCAN tool pilots. These pilots have specifically contributed to the cost efficiency and cost effectiveness of humanitarian assistance sub-workstream under the Grand Bargain Cash workstream. So I know that's a mouthful. For purposes of just keeping it easy, we're going to refer to it as C2HOP, but it's essentially a sub-workstream under the Grand Bargain Cash workstream. We'll be providing a little bit more background on what the objectives of the sub-workstream are. I'm personally very excited about today's presentations because it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I love getting it down into the weeds on cost efficiency because I feel like it can have real implications and impacts on the programs that we have and the amount of people that we reach. Additionally, this is really a culmination of several years of very hard work by a lot of different actors. And so I'm excited to see us reaping some of the fruits from it. Before we dive in, I'm going to just walk us through the agenda. So I'll give an introduction and a bit of a background to situate where we got to where we are today. Also, just to highlight the importance of this piece of work. We're then going to dive into case studies for Iraq, Indonesia, and Somalia, which Lottie, Emmanuel, and Nasib will be presenting their respective country case studies. And then we're going to wrap it up with kind of a future-looking, where do we go from here by Caitlin. At the end, we'll try to have some time for Q&A as well, since we realize that some of this there might be questions regarding how this can apply to a lot of the partners and agencies on the call. So with that out of the way and without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. The genesis of C2HA, or the cost efficiency and cost effectiveness in humanitarian assistance sub-workstream, really dates back all the way to the start of the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain Commitments, which essentially happened in 2016. I don't know if some of you can recall, but during that time, there was the impetus for kind of starting the Grand Bargain Commitments and the World Humanitarian Summit was this realization, and I'm going to quote, that we were faced with the reality of a woefully under-resourced humanitarian response, that the status quo is no longer an option. We have to do much more, far better, end of quote. And that statement seems to ring true as much now as it did then with the COVID crisis in the world. So with that being kind of the impetus of that we need to do far more, far better, that challenge was accepted and several interested stakeholders joined forces under the C2HA banner with two specific objectives in mind. And I'll just read these. So the first was to gather, synthesize, and analyze learning on metrics for measuring cost efficiency and cost effectiveness of humanitarian assistance to meet basic needs. Secondly, based on that, the learning that we gathered, we wanted to develop a set of recommendations for how those metrics and methodologies might be improved and how it could be applied more widely and what are the remaining knowledge gaps from that process. So in 2018, C2HA hosted a learning workshop on cost efficiency and cost effectiveness metrics. And that brought together some of the leading thinkers and some of the leading research and analysis in this field and tried to kind of consolidate a lot of the learning. And that resulted in the development of the best practice guidance for humanitarian assistance in terms of cost efficiency analysis for basic needs programs. So this document that came out of that whole process was essentially a guidance document on how to conduct cost efficiency analysis for basic needs programs in a more standardized, harmonized manner across projects and partners. So if you haven't had a chance to actually look at that document is public, and it's the one that you see the screenshot here on the screen. And it provides a lot of very helpful tools in terms of what to consider if you are planning to conduct cost efficiency analysis. So with that harmonized cost efficiency kind of guidance and analysis in place, partners undertook the next step, which was to operationalize and to try to build learning from this. So we're very pleased today that IRC, in partnership with Mercy Corps, Save the Children Care, and Action Contra la Hambre, are sharing some of those findings. So this is kind of a culmination in some ways of all of the hard work that's gone into the guidance pieces, the learning, and now we're going to find out some of the results. Specifically, I'll note that IRC has molded a lot of the guidance and learning into their scan tool. So it's essentially just a tool that they use that's built upon the principles that are in the cost efficiency analysis guidance document. So when we talk about the scan tool, it's basically just a method for practically applying those tools in analysis. So we're really hopeful that these findings will help to contribute to ensuring that we're getting the most bang for our buck, especially in a world now that needs us more than ever to ensure that we're really good stewards of the resources we have. Now I'll pass it over to Lottie to introduce herself as well as then start walking us through the Iraq case study. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rocco. And a warm hello to everyone calling in. It's great to speak to you all. I'm Lottie Douglas, Mercy Corps' Senior Global Advisor for Cash and Early Market Recovery. However, today I'm representing a case study from the Cash Consortium for Iraq, the CCI, comprised of the IRC, DRC, NRC, Oxfam, and Mercy Corps as lead agency. I was the director from 2016 to 2019, and during that time, we used SCAN to explore the CCI's cost efficiency within a wider value for money study. This process informed and enabled the realignment of delivery costs to cash transfers and resulted in a huge amount of learning that really impacted the ways that we worked. So today I will summarize how we did it and what we learned. As background, the CCI was established to enhance the impact of multi-purpose cash assistance to better meet the needs of conflict-affected households through enhanced reach, harmonization, and coordination. All 5 members implement all aspects of the cash transfer program cycle from start to finish, coordinated in terms of their geographic coverage and harmonized in approach. All members also provide households with access to integrated legal counseling and support to obtain civil documentation delivered by the IRC, NRC, and DRC. So why did the CCI decide to explore its value for money? Well, firstly, we had made our own commitment to evidence our value for money. The CCI had been established and structured with a focus on cost effectiveness, promoting reach, capacity, timeliness, accuracy, harmonization. However, we face growing pressure to also evidence the degree to which the CCI as an operational model promoted cost efficiency. So when the CCI was developing its 3-year strategy, we committed ourselves to conduct a study to explore and inform if and how we could enhance our value for money, including both cost efficiency and effectiveness. Secondly, it was the right moment. We were operating at significant scale. Our governance structures and data sharing processes were mature, and our programming was, by this point, acutely harmonized, which would enable a like-for-like comparison between and among consortium members. Thirdly, we had support to design the study properly. We had a really strong and trusted partnership with DFID. They agreed to fund our value for money study, including both the cost efficiency and effectiveness components, and for us to publish the cumulative whole of CCI findings, but internally learn from the differences we identified between CCI members. We also worked with DFID to lay out a plan which meant we could move ahead with our budget as proposed to kind of avoid arbitrarily ripping out costs at the proposal or agreement stage that would risk undermining our effectiveness, and move ahead with implementing the program while also conducting a value for money study, which would then properly inform a budget realignment on the basis of data and evidence for the remaining part of the project. So how? To analyze cost efficiency, the CCI used the SCAN tool because firstly, it would provide a consistent and comparable analysis of cost by each CCI member and could be tailored to their different financial systems. And secondly, it allowed the CCI to leverage internal headquarters resources among its members, which would itself promote value for money. Next slide, please. Just to note, although the focus of this, although not the focus of this presentation, it's important to note that our cost efficiency analysis was combined with a deep dive into the CCI's effectiveness based on the CALP operational models framework. We ultimately combined all the efficiency and effectiveness results to paint a more complete picture of our value for money and answer the question, what does it cost for the CCI to effectively deliver multi-purpose cash assistance? So moving on to what we learned from SCAN about our cost efficiency in one number. These results reflect the analysis of expenditure data after 10 months of programming on an £18 million DFID award, including all direct and indirect costs associated with the program. The CCI's cost transfer ratio, the CTR, was found to be 48 pence. This means for every £1 of assistance delivered, the delivery costs were 48 pence, or a total cost to transfer ratio of 1.48. Next slide, please. So what did the results mean to us? Well, once the initial cost models had been completed in the SCAN tool, we worked together to estimate how each of the costs had been used across different implementation activities. This was a really exciting step and evidences a really interesting example of different ways we can use the analysis produced by SCAN to inform program management. So first we developed the activity groups listed here on the left-hand side. Then each CCI partner assigned proportions of each cost to the agreed upon activity groups, as illustrated by this completely made up logistics coordinator example. Next slide, please. In doing this kind of analysis of the SCAN results, we were able to understand programmatically what was driving our costs. What this slide shows you is how costs related to different activity groups contribute to that 48 pence it costs for the CCI to deliver £1 of assistance. You'll see the top four in blue were the activity groups that were identified as driving our costs the most, contributing a larger proportion of the 48 pence than the groups in orange. This includes pre-distribution assessments, preparing for distributions, and post-distribution activities. Next slide, please. And this is where you can hopefully get a sense of what we could do with this information. So firstly, I've pulled out some examples of the evidence-based decision-making that this analysis enabled. If you remember the earlier activity group slide, distribution activities were identified as a cost driver, accounting for 13 pence of the 48. During our workshops, we looked at all agency-specific iterations of all these cost models, alongside the cumulative whole of CCI versions. During that process of discussion about why some agencies' costs were higher than others in this category, we realized that some agencies were consistently holding smaller cash distributions, which made them more costly. However, other agencies reported that their slightly larger distributions hadn't impacted the quality of service delivery, the number of complaints, access, or accountability. So a slightly larger average distribution size was adopted by all. PDM and feedback mechanisms were monitored closely, and our cost efficiency was enhanced without impacting our effectiveness. Moreover, post-distribution activities was another cost driver, accounting for 7 pence. So we looked into it. A key tool in the CCI's approach to gauging impact, as identified in the effectiveness study, was its longitudinal panel approach to conducting PDM. So we could understand changes in households, expenditure, and circumstances over time as a result of the cash transfer. However, the effectiveness report questioned the value add of all 3 surveys for each month of cash assistance and recommended we drop the second PDM survey, which could promote greater cost efficiency without negatively impacting our effectiveness. Next slide, please. Another important use of the analysis was that it allowed us to better explain our costs and to discuss real trade-offs between efficiency and effectiveness on the basis of evidence. The preparing for distributions activity accounted for 11 pence of the 48, and within that, our targeting methodology was identified as a cost driver. The CCI methodology was and is, wherever possible, to go door to door across whole communities to conduct household assessments of all potential recipients within a given area to promote accuracy and inclusion. Although the field teams are extremely practiced and skilled at moving through this process, it is labor intensive and therefore costly. However, alternative approaches in Iraq, for instance, lists or community targeting models, were deemed less likely to identify the most vulnerable consistently and fairly. In addition, the targeting model had been adopted by the cash working group, and the methodology was the basis for linkages with the social protection system. The approach to targeting was also the vehicle for automatic interagency referrals through to legal teams to provide households missing civil documentation with the support they needed to obtain it. This integrated piggyback model of providing legal support to obtain ID was evidenced as incredibly cost efficient compared to other legal assistance programs. Therefore, both the CCI and all of our donors across the board were incredibly supportive of maintaining the methodology and did not wish to trade the accuracy, the impartiality, the consistency for lower delivery costs. The scan analysis enabled me, in this case, to better explain our costs and the value add, and to advocate for enough resources to ensure the effectiveness of our targeting wasn't reduced. Finally, as the needs shifted in Iraq and chronic vulnerability increased, more households were eligible for the multi-month cash transfers than we'd originally anticipated. This required a request for modification in order for us to provide the most relevant type of cash assistance to meet identified needs. However, the proposed realignment from one-off transfers to multi-month transfers would ultimately decrease the total number of households we could serve. The analysis, the scan analysis, enabled us to show that the realignment to multi-month cash assistance was not only a much more relevant response to the needs we'd identified, but also more cost efficient, because multi-month cash transfers cost less to deliver than one-off transfers. So with this analysis, we could also advocate on the basis of cost efficiency and be much more intentional and informed about how we realigned anticipated savings from cash delivery to cash transfers, which enhanced the overall request for a modification. So these are just a few snapshot examples of different ways we use the analysis produced by SCAN, and I hope they help to demonstrate the value. I'd really encourage other programs to look into using SCAN. It lay the foundations for our entire value for money study. In summary, it enabled us to understand and explain our costs while also helping us to identify where we could focus our efforts to enhance our efficiency and maximize the impact of our work without reducing our effectiveness. So with that, I'll hand back over to Caitlin. Thanks for listening.
And I think I can hand directly to Emanuela to talk to us about Indonesia.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. I'm Emanuele, and I used to be the Save the Children focal point for SCAN. And while I was at Save the Children, I led the pilot with the Indonesia country office that we did back in January of this year. During the pilot, we focused on the analysis of the emergency response program that Save the Children led as a response to the earthquake and tsunami that hit the central Sulawesi province at the end of 2018. To give a little bit of background, at the end of September 2018, the Sulawesi province was hit by a series of strong earthquakes with a magnitude of 7.5 that quickly generated also a tsunami. As a consequence, around 79,000 people were displaced for their homes and forced to relocate in emergency sites, often overcrowded, and with limited access to basic services such as latrines or clean water. Save the Children promptly, with its country office, with the Indonesia country office of Save the Children, promptly responded to this emergency, implementing a one-year program across 3 thematic areas with 3 main interventions. One intervention was a cash transfer intervention, and the program planned to transfer, to do some conditional cash transfer to those affected. And the transfer were conditional on using the funds to construct semi-permanent or transitional shelter. The second intervention was a wash intervention. And in this case, the program built some emergency latrines. And under the third intervention, there was a shelter intervention. The program trained some villagers on some construction skills and provided some relevant tools to build new and more resistant dwellings. Next, please. In order to calculate the cost efficiency of the cash intervention, we use the cost transfer ratio, measured as the ratio between all non-transfer costs to the value of the cash transferred. And the result that we obtained could tell us what was the amount spent to transfer $1 to the beneficiaries. For the wash intervention, we calculated the cost per person per year of latrine access, while for the shelter intervention, we calculated the cost per person trained in this business skills training. Next, please. If we focus on our cash intervention, we noticed that our analysis showed that transferring $1 to the beneficiaries cost $2.4, including this dollar transferred. And that this figure, this $2.4, includes all type of cost. So the direct project cost, the direct shared cost, and also the indirect cost. If we narrow our analysis only to the direct project cost, so only those directly related to this cash intervention, the cost per dollar transferred is 2.02 in total. Next, please. Comparing the results of our program to similar programs could help us understand the performance of similar programs and at the same time understand how we could improve the delivery of our programs and at the end our cost efficiency. We decided to compare the results of our program with the IRC response to Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines. At first glance, it might look like our program was significantly less cost efficient. However, after like a careful review of these figures, we noticed at least 3 main reasons that could have led our figures to an increase. First, our intervention was a conditional cash transfer, while the IRC one was unconditional. Therefore, our programs might have spent a little bit more to ensure a correct use of the resources. Second, our intervention targeted a bit more than 500 households. There is less than the 3,800 in the Philippines under the IRC response. And this might have limited our opportunities for economies of scale. And finally, the location and the year of the 2 programs were different, and this might have impacted the cost as well. Next, please. During our pilot, we learned a few lessons and we can summarize in 4 main ones. The first is the importance of a proper planning of the whole process. We realized that we couldn't just say, so since we did a pilot for other programs as well, we realized that it was really important, the planning and understand and thinking in advance when is the best time to carry out an analysis, if it should be during the program or at the end of the program, and when at the end. The time frame that we wanted to consider, in this case, since the program was a one-year program, we decided to cover the whole year. The objectives of our analysis and how we are planning to use the evidence that we were gonna generate. Secondly, we noticed that it was extremely important having someone that was really familiar, not only with the program itself, but also with its finance. For example, when we were doing our analysis, we were categorizing and some cost items, and we noticed that without someone that knew the program, but also knew some specific finance codes, this wouldn't have been possible. Third, we realized that the analysis won't tell us if the program worked or not. It won't give us a figure that will necessarily say, yes, it was a good program, or no, it wasn't a good program. But it will rather give us a figure that could support us during this assessment. And finally, since we noticed that since the tool focuses on cost efficiency and not on cost effectiveness, it might be particularly important in cases of humanitarian responses like ours, in which the implementation is really quick, and sometimes it finishes before even we can run an evaluation to calculate the impact. Next, please. And during our pilot, we identified three main uses of the results we generated. First, since it was an emergency response, we realized that the program is really unique and has its own peculiarities that cannot make it comparable to other programs. So the first use was for performance assessment and reporting, both internal within Save the Children and also externally with the donor. And secondly, we identified some opportunity for internal learning. Even though we can't really compare our results with the ones of other programs, we can at least compare our results with our internal targets and objectives. And this can help understand what worked best and what can be improved. And finally, we realized that this result can support the creation of an evidence base for internal and external learning that can be really important as in the future we roll out similar programs, even though we are not gonna implement the exact same program. It might be really useful to understand what really didn't work and what really worked in case we need to implement an intervention in a similar scenario. Thank you.
Thanks, Emanuele. And lastly, for our case studies, I can hand over to Nassim.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen, and everyone. For Somalia, you know, as part of the IRC global strategy, in 2015, the IRC, you know, developed its first cash strategy with the commitment that that we deliver our assistance through cash and voucher assistance. So from that, generally there has been growing use of cash in almost all our outcome areas within health, economic well-being, safety, and power to some extent. So generally for Somalia, the same has been there. But for us, within this analysis, we have analyzed some of the projects where we're doing cash transfers. We've considered some projects with the cash volume of around 900,000 provided to households, you know, affected by cyclical shocks like droughts, you know, floods, locusts, and all others. Generally, I think we will see when we go to the next slide, but generally from the analysis, is what we wanted to see was whether short-term grants are long-term grants, you know, are more cost efficient than short-term grants. So from this, you can see some of the grants we have analyzed, but we have compared two grants, one which is a small short-term grant funded by CEDA, and another funded by DFID DF203, multi-year project where we are implementing a lot of activities implemented by a consortium called Building Resilient Communities in Somalia. So, so the analysis is based on some of the cash programs we have implemented in both the long term and the short term, just to see which one is more cost efficient than the other. So next slide, please. So from the analysis that we have done using the scan tool, we're coming up with some key takeaways from what we've done. What we're seeing is that the long-term funding could be more cost efficient than the short-term funding. And if you really look at the analysis, we're seeing that the delivery cost for the long-term funding is around 37 cents to transfer $1, where we are using, 67 cents to transfer $1 for the short-term funding. From there, then what we are seeing is that we're having some cost savings for the long term, almost half when we compare with the short-term funding. And why we think that is actually coming up is because for the long-term grants, we have got, developed, long-term engagement relationship with the communities that we're supporting. We have this constant relationship with the donor on how fast we can act when there is a crisis. And also, within the consortium partners, exchanging information and all that. So that really isn't, with much of the costs that you would have incurred when a project is new. You have to write, proposal, wait for some time, and all that. So with a long term, apart from the cost efficiency, we are able to respond, much faster, quickly to the beneficiaries without having to write new proposal. So that in itself shows some level of effectiveness in terms of timeliness. So next slide, please. So the other takeaway is what we're seeing is that the amount of money that is transferred is a major factor for the cost efficiency. So programs that transfer huge amount of cash to the beneficiaries tend to be more cost efficient than the ones that transfer a small amount of cash. So for the BRICS project, which is a long-term, large and flexible project, with the cash we had, we were able to reach, more beneficiaries in more locations, enhancing our effectiveness. But generally, from what we have seen in terms of the analysis, what drives the efficiency is how much you have transferred to the actual beneficiary. If that is small, and our indirect, as well as direct program costs, are almost very high, that's likely to reduce the cost efficiency. So the main driver could be how much we have transferred to the beneficiary. Next slide, please. So the third takeaway is once we have done some analysis of the costs in the different stages of the activity, we're seeing the costs are driven, driven by the preparations for distribution. That's where we're seeing a lot of costs are incurred. And this is due to because this is where we're doing registrations. This is where we are mobilizing community members on the project. This is where we're doing verifications, introduction to community feedback, and especially it also depends on the geography, and especially in a country like Somalia, where rural communities that we are targeting are really very far, and the road network is really poor, is rough, and the train is rough. The cost of vehicle rental cost is usually very high. And so what we're seeing is the transfer costs really, the preparation for distribution costs really high than any other category within the activities that are done. But for us, there is a very good learning on this, on what we can think about in terms of how to reduce the costs for the preparation for distribution. Even though I know we really need to provide quality, assistance, being accountable to the beneficiaries, ensuring the right targeting is done. But again, we were thinking about if maybe with a long-term engagement with communities, we're able to profile community members, have registration lists in place in advance, we're able to reduce costs incurred. Also in other places, maybe where the sources are trusted, if we can have registration lists in place from government or from any other humanitarian actors working in the locations, and the same people are affected, I think that's also something that can reduce the cost. Next slide, please. I think that's all, but generally the whole learning is that what we're learning from the analysis that we've done is we're doing some internal learning where we are including some of this learning from the analysis that we have done into our project design. So from that, we are trying to reduce, in as much as possible costs so that we can reach more beneficiaries, have more impact, and the like. So generally, that's all from my end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naseeb. All right, we are not nearly as far behind schedule as we might be given how much interesting stuff I think we've packed in here. So I'm going to try and see if I can keep this to 5-6 minutes to talk about some of the collective lessons we learned, not so much about individual cash programs, but about applying this kind of cost efficiency analysis and the scan tool itself and what we think the path forward is from here. So reflecting from these pilots, and as you maybe picked up from Emanuela's presentation, we've also been piloting SCAN for programs other than cash and vouchers assistance, latrine construction, nutrition programs, etc. There is a pretty consistent set of lessons about what you can use cost efficiency analysis for. Number one is for performance management, where there's a sense of a target that you can establish, and then you measure how well the program is doing relative to that target. I think Lottie gave an excellent example here, where we compared performance to the benchmark set when the initial budget was written. We also looked a little bit at other cash programs in the region, and we explored then what factors were driving the costs higher or lower. Doesn't necessarily mean that we conclude that lower cost is better, but that we have some sense of where normal efficiency is and why we might be a little bit different from that. Use case number 2, I think, is really about learning, comparing many different programs to understand what are the factors that tend to drive cost efficiency. I think this was a really lovely example from the Somalia case study, where we went in very interested in understanding how the length of the project, the award usually that's funding the project, influences cost efficiency. And it turns out that actually has a big impact, through this mechanism of when you have longer term awards, you can usually get more money out. That gives you these returns to scale, lets you ultimately kind of reach more people per dollar. So when you've got good analytical questions going in, you can learn things not just for that one context, but more broadly. And then the third use case is about planning. We didn't share this example today, but Mercy Corps, in some of our other pilots, took prospective budgets for a cash program, ran them through the SCAN tool, and then they were in a conversation with their donor about how much would efficiency be different if a larger tranche of cash was available, similar to the lesson we were just saying from Somalia. They could actually kind of run that scenario analysis through SCAN and make the case for running the program in a particular way, understand the consequences of that. I highlight the use cases because one of the really big, meta lessons, kind of overarching principles that we've arrived at is that cost efficiency is not something that we should be doing for every program, every year, all the time, kind of no matter what. I think you can sense how much effort and careful thought has gone into the work that the three panelists presented. And so we want to make sure that that's being done at a point where there's actually flexibility to make changes to project budgets or log frames. I think the Iraq example was really wonderful because it was clearly aligned with an upcoming budget realignment. There was a moment where they were going to be able to change things around in the way they delivered the program. And what we've seen in other cases is when we start doing efficiency analysis, every quarter, every 6 months, sometimes we discover things, but we're actually not able to make any changes because they would require shifting things in the budget or the log frame. So we need to be strategic about when these analyses are done. And usually we need a facilitator working with the SCAN tool to help walk through this process of identifying the analysis question and the right moment. SCAN really helps with the methodology, but we have still needed people to walk our country programs and our cash teams through those more analytical decisions. I would say also when cost efficiency analysis is conducted kind of universally rather than strategically, we've really seen it change how people perceive the purpose of the exercise. It kind of detracts from the focus on activities and improvements, and it becomes just a box ticking reporting exercise. There's only so many things you can do at once, and if you're trying to do efficiency analysis of 7 different activities, you can't spend as much time thinking about what it really means, your results for any one of those. So another argument in favor of being strategic. And then the last lesson was it's really hard to make efficiency analysis kind of seem worthwhile for an individual project in an individual country if they're analyzing activities that don't yet have comparative data. And this is much less of a problem for cash programs than most others. There's more public data available, but I think this speaks to the need for ongoing coordination. We have a lot of results around basic needs cash, but we have very few results around, for example, cash for protection. And so we want to be really careful in what we ask people to go out and do analyses of, because we don't want them to have to do a whole bunch of work and then they can't learn very much from it at the end. So I think we're interested in continuing to talk about coordination and sharing of results so that people get the most out of doing this work. What's next for the SCAN tool itself? This is one of the questions that's come in through the chat. The tool itself was kind of co-developed by the Systematic Cost Analysis Consortium, which has 5 members, ACH Care, IRC, Mercy Corps, and Save the Children, and was done with funding from the Dutch Relief Alliance's Innovation Fund. We have now got to a point where we developed the SCAN tool into something we think can work for any agency. As Lottie alluded to, it can be adapted to different finance systems. The interface is pretty flexible to be changed to use your agency's terminology. And so over the next 2 years, having kind of built this tool that we think works and makes this analysis possible, we have a couple of objectives. On the one hand, we're going to be supporting new implementing agencies through the process of installing SCAN. Secondly, we want to provide that kind of technical assistance for applying SCAN and using results, helping people understand this process of what's the right analysis to do, what's the right moment to do it to get the most out of it. And then thirdly, we're going to continue advocacy work with other actors to align SCAN to other initiatives and ensure that this kind of data is used appropriately. It's been really interesting sharing kind of lessons around value for money reporting and learning, this intersection of research and monitoring evaluation across our 5 members, and we want to keep that going. So we'll continue having kind of 3 big activities. Very basic support, talking to IT departments and finance departments about installation or developing new features for the tool. Support for people actually using the tool within implementing agencies. And then an advisory group where we've to date been working with people from UNHCR, ECHO, USAID, DFID, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to kind of develop a common vision for using efficiency data. And I will say one of these questions was kind of where can we learn more? We are in the process of releasing a lot of information about this last year of piloting. And one part of that is we are actually changing the name from SCAN to Dioptra. So there is a website up now at dioptratool.org that has a lot more information about how the tool works, these case studies in cash, but also other areas, and the consortium that manages it and how you can access it. And this includes a full demo of the tool for those who want to be able to access it. So I'm happy to answer more questions there. The other question or prompt I wanted to throw in for our discussion section is about this issue of sharing data, sharing lessons, and drawing conclusions. And I think that Sam Brett has just posted kind of exactly this question in the chat, which is, is this work stream the right place on an ongoing basis to be sharing lessons and drawing conclusions? Is there more we can do? As kind of the grand bargain evolves, should we even be thinking about other structures, CALP, or any of the clusters that we could use to continue facilitating this process? So that was a question I really wanted to throw out to the crowd for people's inputs. But that was the last from us. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share these lessons. And most of all, thank you to Mercy Corps, Save the Children, IRC Somalia for coming and sharing your experience and for putting all the work in to do these analyses and think really critically about what the results mean and how we can use them to deliver more for clients. With that, I'm going to start throwing out questions from the Q&A to panelists. The first question, we had a couple of people ask at the beginning, was to Lottie, and was about the decision to switch from single month to multi-month cash transfers in Iraq. What drove that decision? Was it driven by the cost? Was there feasibility analysis? And why did you say it was less expensive than a one-off, which may be a little counterintuitive?
Yeah, sure. Good question. So first of all, what drove the request for the modification or the realignment in that case really was the fact that was relevance. The people that we had assessed demonstrated a higher vulnerability score, which meant they were eligible for all 3 transfers. And so that, therefore, is the assistance that we therefore wanted to provide. However, the SCAN analysis essentially enabled us to put a much stronger case forward. So we would, yes, have to reduce the total number of households that we were serving. Oh God, sorry, my alerts are going off. But because the targeting is a cost driver, that meant that the cost of delivering that assistance would decrease. and we would be able to allocate more of our budget to cash transfers. Does that make sense? Because we're not having to target as many people. And because of the scan analysis, we could be much more intentional about not only just applying for a kind of a revised set of targets, but also shifting the costs that were allocated for the staff required to conduct more targeting into the cash transfer lines as well. So it made for a much stronger case, in addition to the relevance of the type of assistance that the households were actually eligible for.
I can remember some of those conversations in Iraq, and for me, it was a really wonderful example of how efficiency analysis helped understand the consequences of decisions that the cash experts were considering taking, but did not drive that. I don't think anyone, sensible would suggest you switch from single month to multi-month for the sake of the efficiency. It was really, given that they were looking at doing this, we noticed that there could be some efficiency increases, which meant we could take some money and redirect it into the cash lines of the budget. Next question was, where did it go? There was a question I would love Emanuela's thoughts on, which was, do we have any estimates of the cost of conducting the cost efficiency analysis itself? What was the level of effort, and did most programs do this kind of purely internally, or did it require TA or consultants?
Yes, Caitlin. So in our case, well, the program was implemented by the Indonesia country office, and we instead, as Save UK, were piloting scan. So we said, why don't we work together in this analysis on this cost efficiency analysis using the scan tool. So in our case, I, as focal point of Save the Children, traveled to Indonesia and worked with the country office for 4 days on 2 different programs. One was the emergency response that I showed, and the other one was the NECD program. During these 4 days, there were some time in which everyone was asked to attend the session, and we had some session on value for money analysis in general, some session on the use of scan, and then we separated the groups. We had one group with one group per program, and in that case we asked all of them first to do an analysis all together to try to understand how to perform successfully a scan analysis, and then we tried to have everyone performing an analysis on their own. So in terms of level of effort, initially it's very important that there is a strong interest and commitment in understanding the process. It's a guided analysis, but still it's important to understand what each steps requires you to do. And then I think, at least my feeling is that after you have committed some time to understand how to really do an analysis, it just doesn't require you too much when you start performing the analysis. And in terms of if they require TAs or consultants, my answer is no, because in our case, well, I, as Save UK, kind of presented the tool to the country office, but then our idea was that the country office would start using it on their own. So our plan is that we were teaching them how to use the tool, and then they could use the tool on their own and passing the tool to their colleagues in their own the country office or other regional offices, and start using it themselves. So having like one champion per country office that could like take the lead and spread the knowledge. So yes, there will need to be someone initially that help the final users, but I think after that, the final users can move on their own, and they wouldn't need too much time to perform an analysis once they are comfortable with it.
Thanks, Emanuela. And I'll add that I think we've learned, you know, that kind of initial guidance help, you know, in being introduced to the kind of analysis and identifying questions is something that needs to be resourced. And there's not, you know, in contrast to introducing a new finance tool or HR tool that has a very obvious constituency, there is not always an obvious kind of group who would own such a tool within humanitarian agencies. And so as we are in the process of planning and fundraising for the next phase of rollout, that capacity, that kind of technical advising capacity is explicitly part of what we want to be resourcing so that people can really embed this and have the analysis and learning capability, not just the tool. There was a really good question about, is SCAN a tool that you want to advocate for governments to use, given their increasing role in emergency coordination, and what training could be made available? And this really, to me, recalls questions that we've had in the past 2 years of cash weeks in Rome and in London, where we were discussing how do we get detailed enough data to do this kind of efficiency analysis. And there have, you know, been efforts, development initiatives have done a number of really good reports trying to estimate the total amount of money that goes to cash transfer or cash and vouchers assistance programming. But they've faced a lot of challenges in getting enough detail on basically everything that isn't the direct cost of the cash or the vouchers themselves. And that's necessary for doing this kind of analysis. You saw Lottie's example of, you know, considering the time of an individual logistics officer is pretty detailed. So the way that SCAN works entirely relies on that level of detail about the actual activities being implemented and costs being incurred, as well as the knowledge of the program staff who ran that program and know, you know, for example, this person spent 70% of their time, you know, working on the cash program, but maybe 30% on the legal assistance part of the program. For that reason, SCAN really has to be, you know, kind of run by, and I would say any efficiency analysis at this level of detail has to be done by the agency that implemented the activities. And the role that we see other actors playing, local governments, donor governments, coordination agencies, clusters, etc., is in kind of setting the incentives to do this kind of analysis. You know, DFID, ECHO have tremendous power in their reporting requirements and can nudge people towards doing efficiency analysis and according to a common standard, but that doesn't mean that they themselves are users of the tool. And I would say similarly, we've thought about kind of host governments as using the outputs of this kind of learning. We've actually used it in a couple of cases at IRC in on kind of system building and government partnership programs to think about the long-term costs and the sustainability. But the tool itself needs to get used by the people whose staff ran the program and whose finance system holds the data. Just going through the questions here, and there was one other question about to what extent have any of these studies been able to parse out participant experience and cost efficiency as we balance out kind of people-centered and cost-efficient. I'll say overall, if you've come from an economic evaluation background, in some cases, if we were doing a big published study, we might have actually quantified, you know, the cost of the time to participants to engaging in these programs. That's not part of what SCAN does. It doesn't show up directly in the analysis. It's usually something that's balanced out against the cost of, you know, doing the program different ways, distributions, you know, at different sizes, or targeting through different means. Lottie, I think you had some discussion of this in Iraq around the decisions about how to structure distributions themselves. Do you, or I don't know, Naseeb, have any thoughts on how you balanced kind of cost efficiency and participant experience?
Yeah, sure. It definitely was factored into our decision making around the size of distributions. the teams that were already holding larger distributions, obviously we could go back and look at the PDM to see, okay, has there been a higher rate of households that have been dissatisfied with the length of queues at distributions from the agencies that were already holding slightly larger distributions? And there was not. And then obviously when we made the shift for the agencies that had been hosting smaller cash distributions, we monitored the feedback mechanisms as well as the questions within the PDM that gauge kind of satisfaction with services very, very closely. Also, the kind of satisfaction and preference of the people we serve, for us, that also featured very heavily in the effectiveness component, which obviously then we merged with the efficiency analysis to have this kind of bigger picture of our value for money.
All right, we're just about at time. There was one other question which was about kind of UN agencies or national government social protection using SCAN. These are really across the board. We are really open to and excited about trying to find ways for more people to use the SCAN tool, share data, and participate in this learning. And we've talked to a few UN agencies about this possibility. COVID derailed some of that a little bit. Less so around government social protection programs, though that's something we'd also be quite keen to explore. So we can, I will provide my email address in the follow-up to this call, and people are free to reach out to me to discuss those possibilities. This is really an inflection point, and so we're happy to open up and see how many more people could be using this resource. Overall, I think what I think we've demonstrated is the learning that can come out of doing this analysis, and especially when it's done in this consistent and comparable way. So we stand ready to find more ways to do that, you know, make the tent bigger, and make this an ongoing conversation. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll be sharing the slides, notes, and a recording after the fact.